What if our understanding of ADHD is partially incorrect? And really, our entire focus right now is to change the chemistry of the brain to help kids focus. And the stimulant medications do work, no question about that. But one of the things that you see in the literature is that if you have ADHD, even if you're on medications, your probability of failing out of college or not making it to college, or in some cases becoming incarcerated, are significantly higher than the rest of the population. So even though we put these kids on stimulant medications to help them focus in the moment, because we haven't addressed the underlying issue to the ADHD, ultimately they can end up in trouble in a much higher statistic and rate than the rest of the population. And this information is important for all parents to know, because this is the fundamental element that allows us to focus, concentrate, and learn. Focus, concentrate, and learn. This fundamental piece is critical to that. And if it's missing, and if it's not appropriately wired in your child's brain, their ability to learn will become less capable, or they will have a harder time learning than other kids. And this fundamental piece is how our brain is wired to receive information. Dr. Jane Miller, 20 years ago, this brilliant occupational therapist, pieced this together. In her book called Sensational Kids, talks about this in great detail. Their website, SPD Star, talks about it in great detail. There's another gal named Carol Kranowitz, who wrote Out of Sync Child, which also talks about this. And the problem is that right now, the occupational therapy world, at least some of the occupational therapists, are now mastering this domain, and they're doing all kinds of incredible things to help kids wire appropriately so they can learn. I'm actually doing this for myself. My daughter is in occupational therapy. That's how important it is in my eyes. Now, the problem is that not all kids get wired appropriately. Why doesn't that happen? Because not all kids move their bodies appropriately from the beginning. Rolling, crawling, scooting, all of the crazy things that kids do where you're like, oh my God, you almost killed yourself, are great things, because with all of this movement, they're actually integrating their brain. They're integrating how their eyes work. They're integrating how sound gets processed. They're integrating how ultimately they can absorb information, because movement becomes the foundation to sensory integration. Movement helps the brain wire effectively, efficiently, so information could be received and processed easily. When there is an error in that, what happens is the brain just gets taxed. It's like it's overwhelmed. The processor can't handle the amount of information because the processor was never wired appropriately. And when that doesn't happen, information processing from the world around us, our own thoughts could be awesome, and we can process that fine. But when it comes to taking information in, it's a problem. Kids that have this have one hell of a time sitting still at the dinner table. One question that is almost 100% predictive. If your kid cannot sit their butt down on the dinner table and they're constantly moving, and every 2 minutes they have to get up and move, and at school it's like, oh my God, Johnny won't sit still. That's because the child's brain is not wired appropriately. Movement for them helps them feel grounded. They move because they need to move. It's actually their brain, their body is craving it. The movement helps them feel good. And when they're not moving, it's the opposite of that. The best way I can equate to parents, and this is probably half wrong, is the kids become almost a little disoriented when they're sitting still. These kids also get overwhelmed in crowded spaces because too much information comes in and they actually short circuit. So these are kids that if you take them to birthday parties, they withdraw. If you're singing happy birthday and 30 people are clapping, they're like, it's too much. Their brains cannot handle that kind of sensory information coming in at one time. These kids happen to be clumsy. Even though they may be strong, they're clumsy, and they just don't know how to use their bodies because they're not wired into their body. And these pictures, when you really look at it, it's very obvious. If you look, it's like check, 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 check. All of these are very obvious in the child who has it. And if the child has this, inappropriate wiring, because information is also how we learn, right? It's not just birthday party clapping. It's teachers talking to you and there's a kid over here and there's a kid over here, at least when we were in the classroom. All of that is too much. And the kid is constantly moving. So 50% of their attention is on the teacher. 50% of their attention is the clock ticking, bird chirping, their body moving. How can you learn? The coolest thing is that this is all treatable. It takes work. It takes a lot of work. It takes 3 to 6 months of occupational therapy, sometimes more. But imagine if 6 months of something allowed your kid's brain to be wired efficiently, effectively for the rest of their life. Oh my God, that's a deal. That's a steal. Now, here's another really cool thing about this, because it isn't just how the brains are wired. Most people aren't asking the question, why don't these kids move their bodies efficiently in the first place? And my daughter is the person who taught me this, because this 11-month-old, when she was 11 months old, this little girl still wasn't crawling. She was actually slithering on the floor because she was so weak. She literally had to pull herself on the floor because she was too weak. And that's when I had this aha moment. What do muscles need to move? What do muscles need to produce force? Energy. When there's an issue with energy production, the child feels too weak to really effectively, efficiently, strongly move their bodies. They'll still move. But comparing my son to my daughter, my son is this like body, 1-year-old, like muscles, deltoids, strong. I'm like, dude, you do not have my constitution. I don't have that kind of muscle build. My wife's family does. Her dad was a bodybuilder. So it's like, oh, well, there's grandpa in the 1-year-old. He's strong, he's moving, he's already wanting to walk, he's barely 1. My daughter wasn't even crawling at this age. She was sliding. Now, the cool thing about this is you can change this. By giving certain supplements that's used in the autism world, you actually can increase energy production, which is what I actually do for my daughter. I give her supplements including carnitine, CoQ10, B12, various other B vitamins, and we increase her energy production. And through that, what happens? Children feel stronger. They feel more confident jumping. They feel more confident moving. Their bodies are strong and they can trust it and they can move it easily, which allows them to then do crazy stuff they wouldn't do otherwise. Another really cool part about this is that think about what the brain cells need to also function, because it's not just the muscles. Think about it. Brain cells take electrical current and pass it down the axon, the little connection to the top of the cell, right? And then it goes through the axon, and then little chemicals get released into the synapse between the two cells, and that's how they communicate. What does all of that need? Think about it. The brain cells don't have just chemicals like floating in air that they just push, right? They have to produce the chemicals, put it in a little thing, a little sachet, if you want to say, move that sachet down the axon and then release the content. What does all of that need? Energy, a lot of energy. And part of what tripped me up early on when I was doing this is I would treat kids for weakness, and then all of a sudden, a week later, they're like, he's more calm. He's not as easily overwhelmed. I'm like, no, that can't be. Like, literally, I was like, no, you're wrong. It can't be. Until like the third parent told me the same thing. And that's when I started going through the literature. And it turns out that mitochondrial activity, energy production activity, significantly impacts each individual cell. And it turns out that even the braking system of the brain, the GABAergic neurons in our prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that actually controls how much information floods in. So we talked about the wiring in occupational therapy, right? So that's one piece of it. But when that information goes into the brain, it turns out the brain has another braking system. And that braking system, the GABAergic neurons, do not fire efficiently or effectively. They become lethargic. They become tired when there's lack of energy. So you get this double whammy where the kids aren't moving, they're not using their bodies, so the wiring doesn't happen. But at the brain level, at the cellular level, the neurons themselves are also fatigued. They're too tired to function. And through that, the actual messaging between the cells, the braking parts of the brain, don't work as well as they should. So what becomes really amazing is when you combine some supplements like energy production, we call them cocktails. When you combine these with occupational therapy and then you dial a few other things in, all of a sudden the child who has ADHD, I mean, literally, the kids I deal with are not the mild cases. I deal with the kids that literally are about to get kicked out of school. I'm talking that kind of ADHD. When we rewire these kids' brains through the work of the occupational therapists and their geniuses in what they do, when you do that along with the supplementation, which helps the kid's body be strong so they can do the occupational therapy, because it's a lot of work. Occupational therapy is not easy for these kids. They need to be strong. They need to have the physical energy to do it. And by doing that, not only do we make the work of the OTs more efficient, more effective, but the brain of these kids, the cells of these kids are also working at a more efficient level, which then allows everything else to click into place. 50% of ADHD is this picture. We're medicating these kids. We're doing all of these things, and I have nothing against medications. I prescribe it when it's needed. I have an issue with the fact that we're not addressing the underlying issue, which then causes these kids to struggle for their entire life. Because what happens when these kids come off the meds? Guess what? The same issues come back up. So unless they're going to be on Ritalin for the rest of their life, at some point these kids are going to struggle. At some point these kids are going to fail because it's too hard. And there's no need for this to be there. If we have these conversations and we start critically looking at this, and I really hope the OT world actually does more conversation and more promotion around this, because these concepts need to be widely known. This doesn't need to be a little secret in some few little corners. And if you happen to have stumbled across the right book, which most of you probably don't even know it exists, I'm sure you guys have not heard of Dr. Miller. I'm sure you have not heard of Carol Kranowitz. And you should. Every parent whose kid has any kind of focus concentration issue should be reading those books. And they need to be talking to someone to see if their kids need these supplements. And we need more doctors to be aware of these concepts so they can help kids ultimately thrive. And that's what this conversation is about. There's no reason why kids shouldn't thrive. And this is one obstacle that we can take out of their way. There's going to be a lot of issues for our future population. They've got plenty of things to tackle. So let's make this be one less thing for them. So please share this message. And if this is relevant to you, read those books. Go online and do a search for sensory processing checklists. There's 100 of them. There are auditory processing checklists. There's all kinds of information out there. And I hope to share this information with you and have all of you start thinking about this, because this may not be your kid. It may be yourself. It may be your husband or wife, depending on who's watching. It may be your niece, nephew, kid in your kid's classroom. They're all around us. And we're just like, oh, this is just this, that's just that. We have the opportunity to make a difference, and help me. I ask you to help me make that happen. Thanks for watching. This is Dr. K. Be well.